Hi, everybody. So it's kind of become a bit of family lore among my sisters and I, and it's called the fitting. And I'll tell you a little bit about how it goes. At least this was my experience. I stood there facing the long, narrow mirror that hang down from my parents' bedroom door. You know, that kind of mirror. And as I stood there, my mom would try to drape over me a piece of half finished blouse or dress or whatever she had been working on. And most of the time, I'd have to very slowly and carefully navigate my arms up into armholes, if there were armholes, because oftentimes there were still straight pins in the fabric as she draped it over me. So I'd have to very carefully put my arms up in hopes that I wouldn't become a human pincushion as she draped it over my head. You see, my mom was a seamstress, aside from being a secretary and a full-time mom. And she made a lot of our dresses for special occasions, for weddings, for piano recitals, for dance parties. And a lot of times she had to alter clothes for us, and for me in particular, because of my especially narrow shoulders. So I would stand in front of the mirror and she'd say, "Okay, Lisa, raise your hands up." So I'd extend my arms and raise them up. And so I looked like a giant T facing the mirror. And then she'd say, "Okay, Lisa, stand still, don't move." And this was the scary part because I knew what was coming. Ever so slowly from behind, her fingers would creep up and start pinching and cinching and trying to get parts that didn't right to fit right. She'd adjust things and she'd try to do it so delicately. But the more delicately she tried, the more it tickled, because usually this was right along my rib cage. And so I'd always kind of giggle and try to pull away and move. She'd say, "Stand still, Lisa. You need to stand still. Don't move. I told you." She'd take one hand and she'd reach for a straight pin that she had kind of cinched in between her lips. She'd grab a pin out of her mouth and she'd secure the newly formed seam that she had made. And this repeated for what seemed like an eternity. And then eventually she'd have to take the garment off, and I'd have to even more carefully and with more difficulty try to navigate taking my arms and my head out of the garment as she took it off. Well, this became a core memory for all of my sisters and I. And it's become a part of lore. And as hard as it was at the time, it always resulted in beautiful dresses and beautiful blouses and shirts. And it always felt very special because it always felt like she was making it just for me with love. It was always impeccably fitted. Several years later, in 2012, my mom died of stage 4 pancreatic cancer. In the short couple of weeks that we had from a shocking diagnosis, we kind of became accidental caregivers. We tried to provide comfort whenever we could, but we also knew there was very little that we could do. And eventually we had to move her into a hospice facility. The night before she was supposed to be moved, I sat next to her in the bed as she laid down. She looked so frail and so uneasy. And so I grabbed her hand and I held it in mine. Her hands were so delicate, and I massaged lotion into them. And I took her long, skinny fingers, the same ones that had spent all that time preparing those clothes for us in a labor of love, and I clipped her nails. It wasn't much, but I felt that it provided some sense of comfort and a kind of dignity. And in that quiet moment, as we were holding each other's hands, I think, at least I like to think, that we both felt a small sense of peace. The next morning, as I was desperately trying to feed her and to encourage her to take just one small bite of food right before we were going to move her to the facility, I tried to hold her head up with my hand because she was struggling to do that. And I tried to feed her just one little bit of pineapple. And suddenly she took a deep breath and expired, and I could just feel the weight of her body lean forward into my hand. She died right then and there. After my mom died, my father tried to move on as best as he could. We all did. My mom had always taken care of everything in the household. So all of the sisters and I had to basically kind of teach them some pretty simple things from scratch. Things like how to do laundry, how to send an email, how to balance the checkbook. And sometimes it was pretty comical. I remember one time, not long after the funeral, I heard a burst of laughter coming from the laundry room. It was my older sister, and she just burst into laughter because my dad was just confounded by all the buttons on the machines. And I remember the very first email that he sent on his very own. It was all lowercase letters. It wasn't spaced properly, and there were some random P's and Q's in there. And it said something like, "This is your dad. I hope you're all doing well. This is my first email." And we were all pretty proud of him. But one thing we missed amidst all of that was his long and slow, almost imperceptible passage into dementia. Over the years, he had been making some unreasonable and questionable decisions that we couldn't fully understand. Was it overwhelming grief? Was it just a part of the normal aging process? We didn't really know. We intervened and we helped where we could, but we slowly started realizing that something wasn't right. And then one day he fell and broke his hip. And within just a couple of days after that, after the first surgery, he broke his hip again. And it was then that we realized this was reality. He needed help. He's in a memory care facility now, and his passage and descent into dementia has sped up pretty dramatically. He is not able to communicate very much now. He's lost a lot of weight, and he pretty much needs two people to even carry him from the bed to the wheelchair and then back again. I try to visit him as often as I can, which is pretty much every day, if not every day. Sometimes I'm over there for lunch or dinner, and I'll help him with his shaky hands as he tries to hold the glass and bring up a glass of water to his mouth. Or I'll help him wrap his fingers around a spoon or a fork so that he can grab some food and put it into his mouth and eat. Sometimes when he's reaching for something or trying to fidget with something that I can't see, but he can, and he's struggling with it, sometimes I'll grab his hands and just hold them and say, "How are you doing, Dad?" A few months ago, we had to put him on hospice as well. And one day, not long ago, I went to visit him and I brought a pair of grooming scissors with me. And I did that because the residents aren't allowed to have things like scissors or razors or lotions, things like that. But his eyebrows had become so thick and wiry and bushy with these gray, single, sharp strands sticking out in all directions. And I just couldn't stand it. And I know he wouldn't have been happy with that either. He always was very proud of himself, that he kept himself clean shaven, and he always liked to look sharp, as he would say. So I told him to close his eyes, and I took up the pair of scissors and I very gently clipped all those stray suckers away, and it made me happy. And he opened his eyes and I said, "Looking pretty good, Dad." And I was so heartwarming to see him smile back at me with a kind of secret satisfaction on his face. That was the old dad that I remember. The old dad that I remember used to stay up with me for hours in those summer evenings in the Midwest, teaching me how to pitch a softball. We'd be in the side yard, in the heavy, humid summer air. The sounds of Midwestern locusts were filling the air, and the sunset was just starting to set. And he'd take my small hand into his, and he'd teach me the figure 8 pattern of a softball pitcher. So we'd extend our hands down and out to the right a little bit, swing it back behind us, back to the left, then lifting our elbow up, and we'd step forward and then thrust forward with the thrust of an underhanded softball pitch. He spent so much time with me that I eventually became the star pitcher of our Little League team. Did we ever win? I don't even remember, but frankly, that didn't really matter. Back at the facility, after a few moments of calm and peace and some happiness, I suddenly realized he had a worried look that came over his face, and our peace was kind of interrupted. And he was getting a little bit agitated and squirming around a little bit in his seat, and I suspected what it was. I looked down, and sure enough, he would have to go to the bathroom and get himself cleaned up. This was happening more and more frequently lately. So I called out to the aide. Her name was Angelica. We call her Angel. And she was about a foot shorter than me and just had a sweet, happy face and a sweet voice. And she looked at me and I looked at her, and then suddenly I realized she was the only aide there that day. So I would have to help her. So she put on her gloves and we rolled my dad into the bathroom. And she said in her sweet little voice, "Okay, Mr. Linden, you're going to have to help us. We'll help you as much as we can, but can you grab this bar here and try to pull yourself up? We'll help you, but we need your help. Okay, Mr. Linden?" And so with all our might, we tried to push him up and help, and it was all we could do to get him even halfway out of the chair onto crooked, unreliable legs. She grabbed his arm with one hand, and with her other hand, she tended to the kind of uglier aspects of caregiving. And I stood behind him, leaving most of his weight kind of resting on me. And after a while, he became a little shaky. So I took my arms and I kind of wrapped him around the torso, trying to hold him up as much as I could. And I talked in his ear and I said, "You're okay, Dad. You're doing a great job. No worries. I've got you. I've got you." We eventually got him cleaned up and sat back down in the wheelchair. And Angel and I kind of looked at each other as if we had accomplished some Herculean task, because frankly, it was a very difficult task. He'd lost a lot of weight, but he still had a lot of dead weight there. And my dad sat down, and with a sigh of relief kind of washing over his face, he was able to kind of eke out a very meek and mild "thank you." I don't know what journey my dad is going to go on. I don't know how his path will end up. And frankly, that does scare me a little bit. But then I go back and remember all those hours that he spent with me in the side yard, teaching me how to pitch a softball. And I remember my mom's fingers slowly and gently touching me and fitting me in just the right place. These were genuine acts of handmade love. I don't have much that I can give my father now, and there's not much that I can do. But the one thing that I do have is a pair of helping hands, and I intend to use them.